Hi, in this Unit 4 video, we will be discussing fallacies. Questions that you should be able to answer once you've gone through this unit will be, what is a fallacy? What are some common fallacies? And how do you identify them? So we're going to cover a variety of common fallacies. Some of these you may have heard of before. We're going to talk a little bit about each one and give you an example so that you can hopefully identify these when you see them come up in an argument in the future. Essentially, a logical fallacy is a flaw in logic. So sometimes when people are making an argument, they use reasoning or evidence that they intend to use as support for their argument. But sometimes the logic of what they're saying doesn't hold up. It may appear to be strong evidence on the surface, but if you examine it more closely or think about it more carefully, you may find that the logic and the reasoning kind of falls apart. And so that's what we call a logical fallacy. And these are things that we should be able to identify when people are making arguments because they don't support the argument. They're weak evidence and they don't contribute to a strong argument or claim. So we're going to start talking about some common fallacies right now. Hasty generalization is a fallacy where we essentially are making assumptions about a group or a range of cases based on just a very small sample size. And why is that a fallacy? Because it doesn't necessarily indicate that whatever conclusion is drawn will apply to everyone, even if it may apply to this small group, but that doesn't mean that it applies to everyone. So the example on the screen here is my roommate said her philosophy class was hard, and the one I'm in is hard too. All philosophy classes must be hard. So obviously you can't make a generalization about all philosophy classes based on two examples. There are lots of examples of this out there, and you'll find many people will use this kind of logical fallacy to support broad conclusions. So be careful of that. Missing the point is a fallacy where essentially the evidence that's provided may support a particular conclusion, but not the conclusion that the author is trying to promote. So in this example, the seriousness of the punishment should match the seriousness of the crime. Right now, the punishment for drunk driving may simply be a fine, but drunk driving is very serious, and the death penalty should be the punishment for drunk driving because, drunk driving can kill innocent people. Now, this argument, this evidence, certainly does support the conclusion that the punishment for drunk driving should be serious, but it does not necessarily provide any evidence to support the idea that it does have to be the death penalty as a punishment. So it kind of misses the point here. The evidence doesn't necessarily support the conclusion that the arguer is making. The false cause fallacy, sometimes called post hoc, is that assuming that just because one thing comes after another thing, that the first thing caused the second thing. And that's not always the case. President Jones raised taxes, and then the rate of violent crime went up. So Jones is responsible for the rise in crime. Obviously, you can't always dictate that just because two things happened closely related in time, that they're related in any other way. You can't say that one caused the other one. Another example of this is, I read this in a book, and I just thought it was an interesting example of this fallacy. That, if aliens came down to Earth and saw everyone carrying around umbrellas one afternoon, and then later on it rained, the aliens might think that the umbrellas caused the rain, which obviously is not the way things work. So that's an example of false cause. The slippery slope fallacy essentially is saying that if one thing happens, then the next thing will happen, then the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and essentially we'll end up sliding all the way down the slope. So people who use the slippery slope fallacy typically want to say, well, if we allow this, then where will it end, right? Essentially, animal experimentation, as the example says, reduces our respect for life. If we don't respect life, we're likely to be more tolerant of violent acts. Soon, our society will become a battlefield in which everyone fears for their lives. It'll be the end of civilization, and in order to prevent this, we should make animal experimentation illegal. So obviously, there's no guarantee that that specific series of events is going to happen. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that says that that series of events won't happen because we've been doing animal experimentation and we haven't ended our civilization. So you have to be careful for slippery slope fallacies. Another example of this is if you've ever seen is it Comcast? I can't remember the company that does the series of ads where it says, like, if you're mad at your cable bill, you'll act out, and if you act out, your daughter will see you act out, and when your daughter sees you act out, then she gets in trouble in school, and when she gets in trouble in school, she gets expelled from school. Those series of commercials are a good example of the slippery slope the slippery slope fallacy. A weak analogy fallacy is essentially when you're making a comparison between two things, but you're highlighting features that are not the most important features. So in this example, the arguer is comparing guns to hammers and saying it's silly to, it's just a tool made out of metal. It's silly to put any kind of regulations on it. But the truth is that guns and hammers are different in many really important ways. You can't take a hammer into a crowded room and kill a lot of people very quickly with a hammer, like you could with a gun. So this is a weak analogy. This is not a strong comparison, and it doesn't necessarily support the argument that the author is making. The appeal to authority fallacy is essentially when we are calling on the credibility of someone else to lend credence or strength to our argument. But it's important that the person that we're calling on is really an expert in this particular topic. Just because someone is a celebrity or well-known doesn't necessarily make them an expert or give them any credibility. Excuse me. For example, if there's an actor who is proposing a specific political or ideological point of view, just because that person is famous doesn't necessarily mean that they're any smarter or that they have any more information at their disposal than we do. So be careful of the appeal to authority fallacy. The ad populum or bandwagon fallacy essentially just says, people use this when they're trying to kind of steamroll people, and they say, well, all these other people believe this, so you should too, right? Not everybody can be wrong. Because we want to conform and fit in with our peers, so if everybody else is doing it, then we want to do it too. But that's not good critical thinking, and we can't fall into this fallacy. We can't just agree with the person just because he says or she says that a lot of other people agree with him too. You have to be careful and do your own thinking for you. So this is an ad populum fallacy, and it doesn't necessarily support the argument. So gay marriages are just immoral. 70% of Americans think so. Just because 70% of people think so, that doesn't necessarily say that who is to say that those 70% of people are right, I guess is the point. So the bandwagon is a fallacy, and it's not good argument. Ad hominem essentially is when checking on time. Ad hominem is when we are attacking the person who makes the claim instead of attacking the argument itself. Instead of, for example, President Trump has been our president for the past few years, and if you want to argue with some of his policies or issues, that's fine. That is good critical thinking and logical reasoning. But if you want to complain that we shouldn't listen to him just because he is orange and has crazy hair or something, that's ad hominem. That's a fallacy, right? We shouldn't essentially focus on the issuer of the message. We should be focusing on the message instead. Hopefully that clears up ad hominem fallacy. We have appeal to pity, and this essentially is when you're trying to really get someone to feel sad or guilty or emotive about a particular topic, and we want them to make a decision that's not logically rational, just based on pity or feeling bad. So in this example, it says, I know the exam is graded based on performance, but you should give me an A. My cat has been sick, my car broke down, and I've had a cold, so it was really hard for me to study. While all of those things may be true, and while I may have some sympathy for the student in this case, that doesn't necessarily logically lead me to believe that the student deserves an A. There's a rubric in place, there are expectations to meet, so that's not strong evidence for her argument, or his argument, I guess. Appeal to ignorance is essentially saying, because there's no conclusive evidence on this topic, you should believe that what I say is true. And this can go either way, in all honesty, and so you'll see there's actually two examples here on the screen. The first one is, people have been trying for centuries to prove that God exists, but no one has been able to prove it, therefore he does not exist. If he did, somebody somewhere would be able to prove it. But the alternate also isn't a fallacy. People have been trying for years to prove that God does not exist, but no one has been able to prove that. Therefore, God exists. That is also a fallacy. Both of these are an example of appeal to ignorance, that because there is no evidence or facts to support one or the other side, my side must be right. I had a student who argued with me about mermaids one semester, and she said that, just because they can't find them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't exist. So that's appeal to ignorance. The only time when appeal to ignorance is not a fallacy is when there has been a lot of really careful scientific study in a particular field, and even through all of this research and scientific study, no evidence has been found to support a particular point of view. And in that case, then it's not a fallacy to say that because there's no evidence, it does not exist. That actually is a rational argument. The straw man fallacy is when you build up the opponent's argument to sound overblown or over-exaggerated or silly so that it's easy to knock it down and make fun of it. So for example, the example on the screen, feminists want to ban all pornography and punish everyone who looks at it. But such harsh punishment is surely inappropriate, so the feminists are wrong. Porn and its fans should be left in peace. So that's not actually what most feminists are trying to say. That does feel like an over-exaggeration of the statement. So it's easy to ignore overblown statements like that. And it overlooks the fact that there's a lot of nuanced conversation that should happen on this particular issue about how to handle it. So that's the straw man fallacy. The red herring fallacy is essentially when you're trying to distract your opponent from looking at the issue carefully by giving them a lot of irrelevant information that doesn't really have anything to do with the issue at hand. Grading this exam on a curve would be the most fair thing to do. After all, classes go more smoothly when the students and the professor are getting along well. Well, sure, that may be true, but just because that's true, it doesn't really support the argument that's being made, and it kind of distracts you from the real point, which is about grading on a curve and whether or not that's fair. That doesn't have anything to do with the relationship between the students and the instructor. A false dichotomy fallacy is essentially, we used to call this the either-or fallacy, and essentially that means that you have to place situations into the proper context, right? And most things in life are not black and white, either or. Most things, there are lots of different options. But the false dichotomy, or the either-or fallacy, essentially just says you have two choices. You have to pick one of them. So for example, this argument, Caldwell Hall is in bad shape. Either we tear it down and put up a new building, or we continue to risk student safety. Obviously, we shouldn't risk anyone's safety, so we must tear the building down. So by placing the argument into a false dichotomy, it forces the reader into choosing one of these two solutions, and it ignores the fact that there probably are other solutions out there in between those two alternatives. There are other ways to make the building safe, or what have you. I'm going to run out of time. I have two left. Begging the question essentially just is restating the argument in the same way again. It's morally acceptable and it's a decent ethical thing to do. That's not really evidence, And then finally, equivocation is when you confuse the different meanings of a particular word and use them in a manipulative way.